Hey everybody, welcome back to the What is Money show. I'm sitting down today with Mr. Geoffrey West, who is the author of a superb book called Scale that we're going to be talking about today. And Geoffrey is also a theoretical physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, which is a place known for a lot of bright minds and brilliant thinking. So Geoffrey, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. You know, I was telling you offline, I think it's been 2 years since I read your book originally. It was recommended to me by a friend, Alex Gladstein. And he knew I had been writing and thinking a lot about this, like where you draw the line between living and non-living, right? It's a very fuzzy line, as your book really points to. And so, you know, I'll just read the title of the book: Scale, the Universal Laws of Life, Growth, and Death in Organisms, Cities, and Companies. So it does a great job of explaining, I guess, the network dynamics or the physics even of these different forms of life. And, you know, maybe we could start there. Like, how do you think about living versus non-living, life versus non-life? I guess, we're like, how do you think about this topic and where do you draw the lines?
Yeah, well, that's of course a very challenging question and one that many people have tried to answer. And I don't think there is, at least to my mind, a truly definitive answer. It's one of these things that you have to say many things, you know, you by example almost. But I think since you introduced me via the book and the title, this grandiose subtitle for the book, that you know, I do consider life beyond what we normally think of as the biosphere. You know, animals, plants, and organisms, microorganisms, ecological systems. More than that, and that to varying degrees, you know, superorganisms, maybe like cities and companies, are also manifest various aspects of life. And, you know, one can sort of make a laundry list of some of those properties, like, you know, metabolizing, using energy to metabolize and be functional in some way, and to take an extreme opposite to that, unlike, you know, just a piece of rock, great big boulder sitting there, even though it absorbs energy, it doesn't use it in any truly functional way. It doesn't need that energy to continue to survive, but a company, an organism, or a city does need continuous supply of energy in some form or another. So there's that, there's sort of metabolism, and then there's things like reproduction, that in some way, in some form or another, typically life reproduces itself and passes on templates of that, of course, our DNA. And it's not so clear with something like a city. You know, to what extent does it reproduce? Well, probably doesn't in the usual sense. There aren't sort of offsprings. Well, I suppose you might consider, you know, suburban developments as part of it. So there it gets, that's where it gets quite fuzzy. But I think a central feature of life, a truly central feature of life that distinguishes it to some extent from what you might call non-living, is adaptability and evolvability and response to external changes. And often that is to try to optimize in some way. This is not necessarily, that's a very touchy question. You know, it's, but so associated with that, adaptability, evolvability is also the concept of growth. That's another aspect of life that is a critical part. That all of these things that you know, I've lumped under the kind of the big question of life all grow. They all start from something that is usually quite small, and via metabolism accumulate more and more of their mass, if you like, or more subsystems that become part of them, whether it's, again, an organism, a city, or a company. And so, it's so I don't have a definition of life, but I have a bunch of characteristics of life that I think are typically shared across all of these entities. And the thing I became interested in, are there sort of these general laws, I call them universal because that's a physics term actually, but are they these sort of general laws that life in its various manifestations obey? And laws, by laws, maybe later as we talk, we can clarify this. Laws not in the strict sense of Newton's laws, that is absolutely precise and this is what it is, but laws that we often in physics especially use the word coarse-grained. That is, again, certain fuzziness. It's sort of low resolution, not the kind of fine resolution detail that is typical of a physical system. I mean, and that's another thing that to some extent distinguishes life from non-living, is that non-living things often have at least parts of them obey very precise laws. And that's, of course, the area of physics. But non-living things often have these laws that allow some violation up to a certain degree. And so the other thing that brings in as a bigger concept, which is that of what we call complex adaptive system. That is a system that is highly complex, and life typically consists of enormous numbers of individual actors, components, interacting among themselves, as I say, adapting, evolving, growing, and so on. And that they have multiple levels of regularity. I mean, like we do. We have, we go from cellular to organism, to organs. We have organs, and then some of the organs were us. But there's these various levels of emergent behavior, and life may have some of those, but not to the same degree, and certainly not to the same complexity. So I haven't answered your question in any precise way, but in a descriptive way. And being a physicist, trying to put those ideas that I've tried to articulate into a mathematical framework where we can make them a little more precise than just the words that I use, because mathematics, one of the great things about mathematics is that it is a precise language. And even if it is describing things that of themselves are imprecise, which is kind of a curious paradox. And furthermore, it allows one to remain, rational, so to speak.
Right. Yes.
And so that's the way. Now that may exclude things, and that's an interesting subject of itself. Is that by demanding that we can put these things into mathematics, one may exclude some very essential features of the systems we're thinking of, and especially life. Right. I mean, it's hard, when you think of our lives, as human beings, it's hard to imagine that we can put, love and hate and ideas, so to speak, into a precise mathematical framework. So that may, that's a truly essential feature of our social life.
Yes.
So I recognize that, but, in terms of my own thinking, I've become, I'm fascinated by those aspects of life. Maybe this is a better way of saying it. I'm fascinated by those aspects of life which can be put into a mathematical, quantitative, and potentially predictive framework.
It's really interesting. The idea of trying to evaluate the world through a lens of mathematics there is some relationship between how you're looking at a system and what you see, right? Like if you put this rational lens on, you might be blind to certain, quote unquote, irrational aspects of reality or life. And maybe that's related to, because the other thing about complex adaptive systems that is really interesting to me is that they have this kind of opaque logic in a way, right? We can't trace causality through a complex adaptive system very easily. We can kind of, I guess we can assign, like as you said, they're not laws so much. I guess they're more like central tendencies, or something to that.
The average behavior, sort of average behavior, or even I like the central tendencies or sort of average. But I would like to go one step beyond that. The idea is to get the essential features in that sense of sort of average behavior, sort of even defining what would be the average human being be, the ideal human being, but then recognizing that there is a whole bunch of statistical fluctuations around that, obviously.
Yes.
But to really, first of all, let's get the dominant behavior understood. So that's where I'm coming from. Let's understand the dominant behavior, and then let's look at these multiple variations.
Yes. It's so interesting that you're intuitively describing praxeology and Austrian economics, actually, which it's a deductive system that looks at axioms. So they just try to develop very specific axioms of human action. The primary one being man must act, which is to say humans use means to achieve ends.
Right.
And so we have a purpose. Basically, every action we take, there's some purpose behind it. And there's other axioms here, like, man values free time. Man prefers goods now versus goods later, things like this. But it's just interesting that you're touching on that already. All right. So about life, I read this definition recently, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. And this was from a book about economics, but also from a physics lens, which I think is a very important connection between two domains. But like you said earlier, they're not the same, right? There's physics, which has these constants we can create formulas and things about, but social sciences are different. We can't formulaically describe what an individual or individuals are going to do. So this book defined life as an open system in a thermodynamic sense, which imports energy and exports entropy. And I was reminded here of there's an old G.K. Chesterton quote that says, "A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it." So what is the relationship, if any, worth talking about, between life and entropy? And it may help to define entropy here too. I think it's one of the most ill understood words in the world. But something I think that my intuition tells me it's very important, but even I don't really understand what entropy is fully yet.
Yeah, so I think even in my book, I talk about this some. I talk about entropy, and I talk about it within the context of something that has been, I don't know, very deep interest of mine for a very long time, and in fact was something that got me interested in all these questions, and the shift from sort of being a physicist interested in dark matter and string theory, quarks and gluons, to thinking about life, so to speak. And that is the whole question of aging and death, aging and mortality. It's always been something that has sort of maybe morbidly fascinated me, but it became more and more interesting, of course, as I got older and began to realize that I was facing my own mortality. And I think in my book, I said, life is a continuous fight against entropy. Because, as you say, as that definition says, it's a very limited definition, but it's a crucial aspect of life. So let me back off a second, because you asked the question about what is entropy. And there is a precise mathematical definition within, the whole physics canon But loosely speaking, it's that if you use energy, well, you have to use energy. When you use energy to create order, so you make a cell, you make an automobile, you make an iPhone, whatever. If you use energy, which you have to do to make that, then inevitably you create some disorder. You cannot do it with, so to speak, 100% efficiency. Or disorder is an inevitable outcome. So in a certain sense, just to give an example, we're worried about pollution in the environment and so on, the effects on the environment of the marvelous things we've done in creating our cities and our socioeconomic system. And the point is, you can't, that's inevitable. It's inevitable that we're going to create pollution, and we're going to have potentially deleterious effects on the environment. The big question is, how do you minimize that? How do you minimize it? Because even if you use energy to mitigate the damage you've done, in correcting it, you still create entropy.
Right.
So you're always going to be creating this thing called, so this disorder is called entropy. And there is a precise definition, as I said, but loosely speaking, that's what it is. So going back to life, and in fact, that G.K. Chesterton quote, it is that when the way we stay alive is through metabolism. That is, we eat and we extract metabolic energy from the food we eat by oxidizing it. And that's our respiratory system. And that feeds our cells, and coherently that keeps us alive. But in so doing, we create entropy. And we do it inevitably by damaging ourselves in various ways. I mean, in our terms, just in creating something called ATP, which is the highly complex molecule, which is your currency of energy. It's sort of your dollar's worth of energy that every cell is creating ATP, and that's what you use in order to stay alive through oxidative respiration. And but the chemical process in so doing creates these, these oxygen molecules, and they can damage your cells. So even though that's keeping you alive, it's also, in a certain sense, destroying you. And in this, and even more explicitly, that energy has to be distributed throughout your body. And one of the primary systems is your circulatory system, your cardiovascular system. I mean, the whole point of that is just the whole point of blood and sending it through the network of your cardiovascular system is to carry oxygen and other nutrients to the cells. And of course, that's what it does. But in so doing, in so keeping you alive, that blood is flowing through tubes. And of course, it's wearing them out. I mean, you create wear and tear, just as your, water running in the pipes of your house eventually creates problems. And of course, you do repair yourself, but that wear and tear is entropy production. And so, you have to repair that as well as you can, but eventually entropy wins. Entropy overtakes because the more and more you're having to supply energy to do those repairs. And as they pile up, you can't afford to do it. Otherwise you'd have to, it's like having, in that sense, we're like a machine. It is like having a car, and you can, you take your car in for maintenance, change the oil and the filters and all the rest of that stuff. And, you can do it according to the schedule in the handbook, but you know damn well that after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, depending on the car and how much you use it, that car's going to fall apart. And the only way you can keep that car going is either not to drive it very often, which is the case of antique automobiles, or you could every time you drive it, repair it. Every time you go out, and of course, the cost of that is totally prohibitive.
Right.
And much better that you drive it and then buy a new one after 5 years or 10 years or 2, whatever it is that you do. And in a weird way, there's an analog that in nature. Better to let us wear ourselves out and produce new ones, which is what, of course, life does. So I'm taking liberties with my analogies, but that's sort of what's happening, and that's what entropy is. And entropy is absolutely central to, especially to living systems, because living systems are, first of all, creating order, because you have to build up this extraordinary system that is our bodies, but then you have to maintain it. And it is the maintaining it is fighting entropy.
Interesting. Wow.
And by the way, there's analogies, I think, in cities and companies to that.
I agree completely. You know exactly where I'm going with this, perhaps. Before we go there, so out of my own curiosity, order and disorder, then, are these relative terms, or are these, I guess, mathematically or definable with mathematical precision? And what I'm thinking of here is, I've read some texts that describe uncertainty as entropy as well. This might be connected to Maxwell's demon, the thought experiment with that. So, and the question here, like the way I'm thinking about this, okay, if we know, for instance, one guy knows Halley's Comet comes around once every 75 years or whatever it is, but someone else doesn't. Well, the guy that knows sees Halley's Comet and he has no new information, right? It's like he expected that already. The guy that didn't know, it's a surprise. So
exactly.
I guess, what is the relationship between entropy and uncertainty? And then as a follow on to that, is entropy actually everywhere, or is it just within networks, as you described, that it's wear and tear within networks?
Yes, entropy is everywhere. I mean, entropy is, it's an integral part. It's sort of like energy is everywhere, because entropy is energy. It's creating, and maybe I should stress this, it's entropy is, as I say, I associate it with disorder, which means it's sort of like useless energy. It's sort of like, friction. Friction is one of the best examples. You create heat, and mostly you can't use it. I mean, it's, when you rub something, it creates that heat, which sort of dissipates. And so it is everywhere, and it's mostly not useful energy. And one of the things, in terms of engineering, is to find ways, of course, to try to make that what appears to be dissipated, not useful energy into something useful. And of course, in terms of trying to, I mean, for example, a trivial example is when you drive your car, it creates heat. That's why the engine runs hot. That's entropy. The engine's running hot. But one of the engineering things that takes advantage of that is to keep you warm inside on your seat. I mean, you use that heat that's generated by the engine, which will go to sort of just out there into the atmosphere. You have to, I mean, of course, it costs you to do that, but it is one way of trying to control entropy. Now, your first question is sort of a tangent to this, to do with information. There's another use of the word entropy to describe a degree of information. And it turns out that the mathematics of that, and what you know and what you don't know, and how you can define the number of bits and so on, the mathematics of that is essentially identical to the mathematics of sort of thermal entropy, heat entropy, and energetic entropy. And so you have to be careful that they don't get conflated. But there are bridges between them. But in the sort of things that I've been interested in, that plays much less of a role than the physical entropy, the original meaning of entropy that was introduced, when people were trying to understand, developing the theory of thermodynamics. And by the way, one of the other things maybe I should have said about entropy, the second law, what's called the second law of thermodynamics, is what I said earlier, is the inevitability of creating entropy. And the second law is very simply stated: in a closed system, so a closed system, entropy always increases.
Right.
That's the statement. And
can we define, sorry, just for the audience, open versus closed system in thermodynamics?
Yes. So a closed system literally means, you can imagine there's some boundary, a box, or some encasement, and no more energy comes in and out of that. I mean, in principle, that's the idea, that there's something that it's closed and it's within the system. So everything stays within the system. Because, so for example, and a fantastic example of it is, of course, the planet. We are not a closed system. We're an open system because the sun is shining on us, giving us energy all the time. And one of the problems we face in terms of our long-term future on the planet, and one of the problems with having exploited fossil fuels, which has given rise to this extraordinary society we live in, the discovery and exploitation and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, was that instead of the planet functioning entirely as an open system, that is, we as human beings, let alone the rest of the biosphere, were getting our energy primarily from the sun, so that we were in this open system, whether we were hunter-gatherers or whether we were agriculturalists, that energy was giving rise to growth of agricultural products that sustained us. But that was coming, the energy for that was primarily coming from the outside. We changed to making it what was effectively a closed system. That is the burning of fossil fuel, because we're just simply burning the surface of the planet. That's what we've been doing. And we've done that extraordinarily well. But we're paying a price for it, because that means that we've enhanced tremendously the production of entropy. And that production of entropy is deleterious in terms of the environment and ourselves and so on. So that's the big issue. That's sort of the big picture way of thinking about it. But it is the difference between a closed and an open system.
Very interesting there. I had never thought about it. So the shift from, let's just say, the agricultural age to the industrial age, for instance, we went from living off of flows of energy, which is like the sunlight falling on the earth. I guess it was somewhat being accumulated as a stock in the agriculture.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's not entirely, obviously it wasn't entirely open, clearly.
But the industrial age took us deep into stock. We started living off hydrocarbons. Right. Okay.
Wow. Something that had accumulated over millions of years, we were now going to use up, that we had stored. I mean, we,
the planet,
so to speak, as a planet, had stored, and now we were using it, not unreasonably. And but it has very profound consequences.
And so harnessing more energy then led to more production of entropy as well, I guess.
Sure, absolutely, hugely. And the movement towards renewable energy could be thought of in terms of, let us try to return to a system that is more open, where we use the open-ended energy of the sun. So we return to that, which gives us much more control on the one hand, but minimizes tremendously the production of entropy.
Right. Very, very interesting there. And then and then in doing so, it also was a transition, as you said, from an open system to effectively a closed system.
Exactly. And
Because
we're now, the question is, can we return to some semblance, at least, of an open system?
right.
Or
Okay.
at least some aspects of an open system.
And that would necessitate, I mean, just in the specific case of hydrocarbon use, that would necessitate us filtering the carbon from the atmosphere. That would be like pushing back against the entropy a little bit.
Sure, that would, yes, exactly. Returning it to the soil, so to speak, or to the ocean or whatever, you know.
It's fascinating. So it's like there's this long-term cycle, I guess, to produce hydrocarbons. And when we start tapping them at an accelerated rate, we inevitably create more entropy. But to fix that, we have to actually accelerate the cycle that returns the entropy to the dirt or the ocean.
Absolutely.
Wow. Interesting.
Exactly. So that's the question, can we do that? And that's a huge challenge.
Right.
You know, and the extraordinary thing is to recognize, I mean, it's sort of obvious, you know, that store that we tap into built up over, you know, billions, if not hundreds of billions of years, and we dissipated in 200. You know, and that's part of the issue as well. So it's also time,
right,
you know, plays a crucial role. The acceleration of time, which is a subject I'm extremely interested in, by the way, is this whole question of, you know, the difference between calendar time, I mean, the time defined by, you know, astronomical or you know, the Earth spinning on its axis and you know, moving around its sun. That's how we define sort of this external, almost objective time. On the other hand, we've also generated a different kind of time, which is our social time.
Yeah.
And we recognize that. We feel often on a sort of accelerating treadmill as time speeds up in terms of our social lives.
Right. Yeah.
And I can tell you, as someone that's over 80 years old, that I have been, my God, have I been conscious of in my lifetime. When I think back to, you know, my childhood in the 50s, and teenage years in the 60s, life, you know, the speed of life, the pace of life, and the pace of change was, you know, viscerally so much slower.
Do you think that is predominantly your own personal experience of time changing as you've aged, or is this has to do with the technological realities that have changed?
I think it's technological realities, and I think there's good reasons for it, which we can go into, and it's part of our success, actually. I mean, that accelerating pace of life is something that has come part and parcel of our, well, this gets into things we haven't yet talked about, you know, our superlinear kind of behavior, scaling laws and so on. But it is part and parcel of our success, is that. And yet it's also, it's a bit like, you know, it's very interesting to me that many of these things, the things that are the source of our success, you know, that you know, like creating, you know, the discovery of fossil fuels and their exploitation, the invention and development of free market systems and entrepreneurship and capitalism, all have been enormously successful. I mean, that's how we've come to this time, but they've also accelerated life, and they also have threatened us in some way. There's a threat in that, and it's sort of analogous to what I was talking about in terms of aging and mortality, that the very system that supports us, our metabolic system, whether it's the biochemistry that creates the molecules that keep us alive, or the networks that distribute energy and resources, they're also killing us. So it's almost spiritual and poetic in some horrible way.
Right.
That, you know, there's a price to pay. It's a bit of a platitude, but there's no free lunch.
No free lunch. Yeah, that's it, as is said in thermodynamics, I think. So, all right. Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. Great stuff there. Let's talk about the things we haven't talked about yet. So you mentioned, I guess this is just the basics of scaling, which really underpins a lot of what you wrote about in the book. I thought the very simple example was captured it well. Like if you have a cube with 10-meter sides and you double the sides of the cube to 20 meters each, what happens to its volume? And intuition tells you, oh, well, the volume doubled. You doubled the sides, so you doubled the volume. But no, you actually increased the volume 8x, which is 2 cubed, which is actually why we say, squared and cubed, right? An area and volume scale with the square and cube of side lengths, respectively. And so that's kind of like, I guess, the foundation there. And later in your book, you explain why Godzilla couldn't be real effectively based on that. So maybe I could just ask you to unpack that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So no, what you say is, of course, correct, is that the most primitive example of scale, well, first of all, what is scale? Scale simply asks the question, if I have a system that's functioning, what happens if I increase its size? What happens if I double the size of everything inside it? Mm-hmm. So, the simplest example, is indeed, a cube. If you take a line, just a simple straight line, and you double the size, the line's twice as long. So that's trivial. But if you had a square that's, 1 by 1, 1 foot by 1 foot, the square, of course, if you double the size, the square, the area doesn't increase by a factor of 2. It increases by a factor of 4 because each side is now 2 feet squared. Long. Yeah. And it's 2 squared. And so similarly with the cube, it's 2 cubed, as you said. So it's 8. So they increase much faster. And this observation was first made, and its implications, its crucial implications, were recognized by the man that, in a certain sense, founded modern science, namely Galileo, in the 15th century. Galileo pointed this out, and he pointed out its profound implications, because what Galileo realized was the following. He asked the question, could you have infinitely tall trees or infinitely tall buildings? And so he said, well, look, if you increase the size of a tree by a factor of 2 everywhere, its weight, which is proportional to its volume, increases by a factor of 8, much faster. On the other hand, the strength of the trunk, for example, holding up the tree, turns out only increases proportional to the cross-sectional area of the trunk. And so that only increases by a factor of 4. So if you keep doing that, eventually the weight that has to be held up by the trunk outpaces the strength of the material of the wood. And so the tree collapses under its own weight. And similarly with buildings, you can't. He pointed out, therefore, when you look at an elephant, it has these great big fat legs because it has to hold up this enormous weight, whereas a dog has nice, thin, elegant legs and so on because it doesn't need it. And and so on. So this, and he expostulated on that. It's a wonderful section to read, actually, even now, 500 years later. But that was sort of the crude beginnings of the question of scale, and that has permeated all of science and all of technology and all of industry, of course, because you build a product and you want to scale it up. If you build an iPhone, how do you scale it up to an iPad, or and so on? And it's non-trivial, actually. So this is the question, or the kind of questions that I eventually got into was: if you have a city and you look at a city twice the size, do you have twice the amount of crime? Do you have twice as many patents being produced? Is it twice as innovative? Does it need twice as long roads, and so on? But I got into this through biology, and the whole kind of taxonomy, if you like, of different kind of scaling laws. And because you can have scaling laws where because the ones that we described on so-called non-linear, as I said, the volume scales by a factor of 8, whereas the length only scales by a factor of 2. And so when you double the size, so that's obviously non-linear, and almost everything around us scales in this non-linear fashion. And the example that got me intrigued in biology was to do with metabolic rate, which is perhaps the most fundamental quantity of life. And if you make an analog to it, is the most fundamental quantity associated with a city or a company, because it asks how much energy, how much food do you need per day to stay alive? 2,000 food calories. And the question is, how does that scale, for example, across all mammals? So, if you have a mammal twice the size of another, does it need twice as much food? Well, you would naively think it might, because there's twice as many cells, and the cells are pretty much the same. So why would what would be twice? Well, it turns out that's not true. Turns out the bigger you are, the less energy per cell is needed to stay alive. And this was discovered in the 1930s by a man named Max Kleiber, who discovered that, to put it into English, if you double the size of a mammal, then instead of needing twice as much food per day to stay alive, you only need very roughly 75%. And it doesn't matter if you double from 2 grams to 4 grams, or 2 kilograms to 4 kilograms, or 2,000 kilograms to 4,000, doesn't matter. You always need just this 75%. And in mathematics, that's called a power law for various reasons. It's got nothing to do with power in the usual colloquial sense, but it's called a power law. And that savings of 25% is expressed by saying the exponent of the power law is 3/4. So he discovered this 3/4 power law scaling law, and it was kind of astonishing. And since then, we've discovered that this is true across all of life. It's not just mammals, it's fish, birds, crustacea, cells, ecosystems, everything has this 3/4. But even more so, what was discovered later was that if you look at any physiological quantity, something as mundane as the length of your aorta, or some life history event as profound as how long you're going to live, that also has scales in a similar way, always has this systematic, regular behavior. And not only that, the savings, as you get bigger, is always a multiple of 1/4. It's always 25%, 75%, and so on. And for those of your listeners that listen to this that are familiar with the idea of logarithms, where you plot data, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you plot it by 1
Orders of
10,
magnitude.
orders of
Yeah.
magnitude. Here's what's amazing is that, for example, that metabolic rate, if you plot metabolic rate on the vertical axis, going up by factors of 10, and on the horizontal axis, you plot it against the mass of the organism, going up by factors of 10. What is remarkable is all data lies on a straight line. And that is sort of fantastic because, my God, we're probably the most complex phenomenon in the universe, life.
Yeah.
It's so complicated and so on. And we believe we evolved by natural selection. You know, we're highly historically contingent. Every cell type, every organ in our body is historically contingent. So what you would have expected had you plotted this, these points would lie sort of scattered across the graph, reflecting the historical contingency, reflecting the evolutionary processes and the specificity of individual random behavior. Quite the contrary, they lie beautifully on a straight line. And this is true of all these physiological variables and all these life history events. And that's what intrigued me 20 odd years ago as to where in the hell do these laws come from? What is the origin? Why could it be that we have this sort of chaotic random idea of natural selection, yet anything we measure looks so regular and systematic?
Yeah, it's truly mind-boggling. And your book does a beautiful job of laying it out. A couple of other things that really struck me there were, and correct me where any of this is wrong, the total number of heartbeats is roughly the same across all animals, right? Just with a smaller animal, I guess, having a more rapid heartbeat and shorter life, larger animal having slower heartbeat, longer life, but the number of heartbeats works out to be approximately the same.
Yes, it's sort of amazing, actually. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned also that I think you said this, a number of patents registered per unit of population. You went into some other economic variables.
Yeah, sure.
That were interesting. So my question here, I mean, it is, if you really reflect on it, it's almost like jaw-dropping, right? To see so much complexity, but then it just falls all on a straight line. It's like all life is derived from something. There's some commonality, some universal here. And is that then I guess the universality of these quantities, we would say with a little bit of knowledge, having gotten through the book, it's pointing towards a fundamental network geometry of nature, something like that, that's inherent to life, but also things that aren't necessarily traditionally considered to be alive, like businesses and cities, as we'll get into. I mean, the other book I mentioned earlier, he made a physics argument too for even the shape of a river basin is kind of based on the same network geometry.
Yeah.
So is that what's going on? Like the universe is some type of network architecture, and then based on the physical realities or mathematical realities of that architecture, that's what shapes everything. Kind of on a limb here trying to form this question, but
let me see if I can answer this. But that's what the book is about, as you say. My book is exactly about this.
Yes.
And it's, first of all, trying to answer the question, where did these laws come from? And then showing the extraordinary interconnectedness and universality among them. And to put it even slightly differently, that, and maybe more specifically, that organisms, cities, and companies obey similar mathematical laws, but they are variations on a theme. Their mathematics is the same, but they do something that makes a city different than a company, and a company different than a human being, and so on. And all of that, and the work that I got involved in, beginning in the mid-90s, was making the hypothesis. Well, I asked myself originally the question, how in the hell can it be that, first of all, that we all, all mammals, first of all, obey these simple scaling laws, and how can it be that, birds do it too, and fish, and crustacea, and so on, what's, what is it? What is the commonality here? So this was the work in purely in biology. And I realized that, of course, the challenge that we all face as a complex system is that here we are, we're made of, our bodies have about 10 trillion cells in them. And each of those cells has to be sustained in a, roughly speaking, efficient, democratic way. So how do we do that? Well, that's what natural selection solved. It evolved networks. I mean, we're a bunch of networks. That's what I realized, that at this level, we're a bunch of networks. And then I made the sort of hypothesis, the leap, that these scaling laws are actually a manifestation of the physics and mathematics of these networks. And it is the physics and mathematics that is basically universal. And so let's see if we can understand where these scaling laws come from. And within biology, where in the hell does this number 1/4 come from? That's pretty remarkable that the so to speak, the magic number of life is 4. It's not 21 or 7 or 13. It's 4. And where in the hell did that come from? So I started thinking about that within this network context, and I made some progress. And then I was introduced through the Santa Fe Institute. I was not a member of the Santa Fe Institute at the time, to a wonderful biologist named Jim Brown, who was in the colleges, basically. He was actually president of the American Ecological Society at the time. And he had been thinking about these questions from a biologist's viewpoint. And of course, was also intrigued by the fact that there were these extraordinary scaling laws. Because when I first saw them, I thought, my God, this must be the key to biology, because biology looks like this great big mess, right? I mean, I'm sitting here, I look across here, and I can see, forests and trees and plants, and just look sort of arbitrary, But it isn't. It isn't, and that's what these laws are telling us. There's a certain constraint, mathematical constraint that's going on. So where does this come from, and how does it relate to natural selection? Anyway, to cut a very long story short, we worked on this, Jim and I, and his then student, Brian Enquist, who is now a highly established ecologist himself. And we derived mathematically the origin of these scaling laws in biology, at least. We showed how it derives from networks, certainly within mammals and in plants and so forth. And the idea is, just to repeat, that these scaling laws and this universality is a reflection of the mathematical properties of these networks. And so I'll just spend a couple of minutes, without being technical, on the kinds of properties of these networks that have to transcend the evolved design, because we obey the same scaling laws as the plants and trees out there, but we're not, obviously we're quite different from them. We're completely different. We think of ourselves quite differently from them. And yet we're both networks. And so the fundamental assumptions or the fundamental principles of the network were sort of the following, that first of all, that the terminal units of the network, so take your circulatory system, the terminal units are capillaries.
Right.
Well, those capillaries, and then they feed cells. Well, natural selection, as it evolved new species, did not reinvent cells and capillaries. They didn't invent the fundamental units. So the difference between you and a whale, from this viewpoint, is the network. It's not the cells or the capillaries, these terminal units.
Right.
And in
the
fact,
nodes, I guess we could call them.
Yes, exactly. So those, your liver cell is very similar to that of a whale or a rat. even though you look different. Those networks are quite different in size. So that was the first sort of principle, that there's these units and we build on those. And the difference, by the way, between taxonomic groups is that you change the fundamental unit, and so you make a huge transition rather than just changing the network. So that was the first thing. The most important principle was that that natural selection, the continuous feedback that is implicit in natural selection, the survival of the fittest idea, and competition, is that has led to those organisms that have been successful optimizing something. They have competed by optimizing. So let me give you a very simple example. That the circulatory system that not just you and I share, and every other human being has shared, but every mammal that has ever existed shares, is one that is evolved so as to minimize the amount of energy our hearts have to do to pump blood through the system in order to feed ourselves and keep us alive. And we minimize that, so to speak, the mundane process of keeping us alive in order to maximize the amount of energy we can devote to reproduction, to sex and reproduction, and rearing of our offspring in order to promote our genes. So that was sort of the idea. And amazingly, when you put all that into mathematics, and that's where all the hard work is, and is to translate those words into a mathematical framework, out popped these scaling laws, and out popped the number 4, the so-called quarter power. And by the way, one thing we haven't talked about, which is crucial, is that it showed that these networks are fractals. And we haven't talked about fractals, but they're fractals. And even if people are not familiar with fractals, turns out you are familiar with them.
Right.
Even if you don't know precisely what the word means, you're very familiar with them, because everybody's familiar with looking at a tree, big tree, and realizing that it's a branching network. The trunk gets, the branches start sprouting out, and those branches get smaller and smaller. But also, very importantly, if you were to cut some branch somewhere up in the canopy of the tree and remove it with all the branches above it attached to it, and you put it elsewhere, put it beside the tree, it just looks like a scaled down version of the original tree.
Right.
Or if you take a piece of broccoli and you take one of those pieces of broccoli, cut it off from the main broccoli, it looks like just like the broccoli. And indeed, you can do the experiment. It's a fun thing to do with broccoli. Is you take one of those, what do you call it, crowns? I don't know what you call them.
Florets, maybe, I'm not sure.
Florets, florets. And you put it aside and you take a photograph of it with your iPhone and then just scale it up with your fingers. It looks like the original piece of broccoli. And that's called self-similarity. And that object is called a fractal. And what we showed was the mathematics of these networks is, in order to optimize the system, approximates a fractal. And that's why they look the way they do, because they've optimized. And going back to your non-living example earlier of river systems, they too have fractal-like structures. Of course, they're in 2 dimensions, but it's a similar idea, because they, in a certain sense, are optimizing the drainage of a watershed, if you like. The water tries to find its fastest way down. And again, if you put that into mathematics, it will look, it shows that it should be an approximate fractal, which water river systems are. And in that sense, they're like you. And to just jump ahead, so it is with road networks and so on.
Yes. No, beautifully said. I I read the book Chaos by James Gleick, maybe
Oh yeah,
10,
sure.
10 or 12 years ago. And he introduced me to the work of Mandelbrot, who clearly, he's the father
Absolutely.
basically of fractal geometry,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah.
Yes, so
And
it's interesting. Yes, Fractal, I should have mentioned that in passing, that the person that brought this, so to speak, to consciousness, not just the scientific community, but broader community, was a man named Benoit Mandelbrot, who coined the word fractal. And he pointed out that most of the things around us that we're interested in on the planet are fractal-like in some way or another.
Yeah, it's. I would encourage anyone that hasn't seen it to go look at the Mandelbrot set too. One of the most beautiful mathematical artifacts ever, and
lovely.
Perfectly exemplifies what we're talking about. Right? It's different everywhere at every scale, but also self-similar.
Yes, but if you blow up one piece of it, you take a little piece of it and blow it up, it actually looks like the original thing.
Exactly, but yeah, slightly different.
By the way, I should be careful about this. Is very important because I said it rather glibly. In general, it's not just blowing it up in a linear fashion. You have to blow it up in a non-linear fashion, and that involves something called the fractal dimension of the object. And that's true of us, by the way. It's not just blowing up our circulatory system.
Yes.
The way our circulatory system is a scaled down version of an elephant's.
Right.
But it's scaled down in a non-linear way, following those scaling laws that I talked about. And the mathematical theory tells you how it is that you should scale it so that the elephant and the human being operate efficiently.
So I want to read, you included this in your book, and I think it's just a cool little, I don't know if it's a poem or what. It says, this is about fractals.
Oh, yes.
So naturalists observe a flea hath smaller fleas that on him prey, and these have smaller still to bite 'em, and so proceed ad infinitum. Thus every poet in his kind is bit by him that comes behind. Great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so on ad infinitum. Just a poetic little encapsulation of the fractal. You mentioned something there I wanted to touch on, though, because that fractal dimension, is that the fourth dimension? Is that why the number 4 is incorporated?
No, it is. It is. Yes, it is. And so here's the. So yes. So now let's go back to this number 4. So this 4, if you go back to the work that we did, the number 4 is actually 3 plus 1. I'll tell you what. And the 3 is because of something I didn't mention about these networks. Another property, generic universal property of these networks, is sort of an obvious one. It's what we call technically space filling. That is, the network has to go everywhere. So it's sort of obvious that, your circulatory system has to go everywhere within your body because every cell has to be fed. Right. Otherwise it'll die. So that's sort of sounds like a trivial statement. It's non-trivial because you have to put it into mathematics, and it's a constraint on the network that everything in the system has to be sort of connected to the network. So just to jump ahead, in a city, the road network is also space filling. It has to end up, every house or every dwelling, has to have access to the road. So the road, eventually ends up, you're on a street, in other words. That's all it says. But to put that into mathematics is not trivial. But so it's a so the 3 plus 1, which I said the 4 is the 1/4, the 4, the 3 plus 1, the 3 can be traced back to the fact that we live in 3 dimensions. We're 3-dimensional. So if we were 5-dimensional creatures, that number would be 5 plus 1. So the number would be 6, not 4, and so on. And indeed, just as a tangential comment, one of the things that intrigued us was, is there a way of testing this because if we were two-dimensional, it would be 2 plus 1, the number would be 3 instead of 4. And so we had a student do some experiments on two-dimensional plants. Plants are, like ivy, grows on a two-dimensional surface. And he did this, he grew these things over a year, and then did all the measurements and found that it was very difficult, but he found that the answer was not inconsistent with the prediction, that it was the third rather than a quarter. The trouble is, this is a more technical statement, that he didn't, you can't, look, mammals go from a shrew to a whale, which is 100 million times bigger. So that's an enormous range, and you can see the scaling beautifully. But trying to grow ivy in the lab, you don't have a scale of 100 million. You have a scale, if you're lucky, by a factor of 5 to 10, which is not really enough to test. But it was not inconsistent. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's a tangential comment. But let me go back to the 1 now. So there's the 3 is because it's 3 dimensions. The 1 is because of a curious property of fractals, which Mandelbrot already recognized way back when he introduced them, that the, so to speak, that, we tend to think of dimension, up, down, sideways, as integer, it's the integer numbers. But what he realized was that fractals, these curious properties of self-similarity, give rise to a generalization of dimension that doesn't have to be integer. It can be 1.23 or whatever. However, if you are maximally fractal-like, that is, you really are taking advantage of space filling and you're really optimizing, the maximum you can change the dimension is by 1. And that's what we do. We optimize the fractality, if you like, the self-similarity, in order to optimize the system and be most efficient. And that gives rise, if you follow the mathematics through, to +1. I mean, this is a sort of to try to put it into English is difficult, and I try to do it in the book with an example, which I'm happy to try to repeat here, but I don't know if you remember reading it. It was about washing sheets in a washing machine.
That one I don't recall.
If I say it might be that I don't know if it's worth spending the time. But I tried to think of an example where, in ordinary life, actually, the dimensionality is increased by 1, even though you don't realize it. Let me try it out.
Okay, please.
Let me try it out. So because it refers back to the very beginnings of our conversation, that if you have a sheet, literally a sheet from your bed, and you were to double the length of each side, we know the area goes up, we talked about it, by a factor of 4, it goes up by 2 squared. And we say, the way we talk about that mathematically, we say the dimension of a sheet is 2, because of that squared. And the dimension, and just going back to what we said earlier, the dimension of a cube is 3.
Right.
So sheets have dimension 2 because they're 2-dimensional. That's why we say 2-dimensional. Okay. Now, there comes a time when you have to wash your sheets. And you want to be very efficient about it. So you wait a long time and you collect all your sheets and you stuff them as much as you can, all these sheets, into the tub of your washing machine. Now, the tub of your washing machine is a volume. So it has dimension 3, 2 times 2 times 2, 2 cubed. That has dimension 3. Now, if you ask how much, even though you have increased, if you double the size of the tub, double the size of your washing machine, the volume has increased by a factor of 2 cubed 8. The sheets, the amount of sheet that you can wash has now increased also because you've stuffed it in and it's crinkled and so on, also by a factor of 2 cubed 8, because you've stuffed it in. Yet each sheet has only got a dimension of 2. So you have effectively, by crumpling it up and pushing it in, even though it's still a continuous sheet, but it's all crumpled, you have increased effectively the dimension of a sheet by 1. You've made sheets into that are 2-dimensional into something that is an approximately 3-dimensional object by crunching it up. So that's sort of, and that's an example of, and in fact, by the way, just a side comment again to that, if you look at the distribution of all the little crinkles, they actually follow a fractal dimension because you're actually taking advantage of fractals. So it's extraordinarily interconnected, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So we sort of do something like that with our incredible cardiovascular system. And indeed, you know, even though you're only maybe, you know, 6 feet tall, I think, I forget the numbers, but I talk about it in the book. I think if you laid all the vessels of your circulatory system side by side, I think they go around the Earth at least once, maybe more. And that's all inside you, which is truly remarkable.
It's a lot of crinkled blood vessels.
There's a lot of crinkling going on there, effectively.
Sorry,
I'm sorry I have to talk too much to explain this.
No. It's very helpful, and thank you. I want to throw something back at you that might be a bit meta, but I'd just love to hear your feedback on it. I have almost considered, just in trying to intuit this geometry of nature we call fractals, I thought about kind of the opposite, which is, I guess, like a sphere, which seems to be the most conservational structure in a way, right? The most energy efficient structure, which is to say you can have, I might be saying this wrong, but I guess maximum volume per unit of surface area.
Correct.
Something like that. Yes. Whereas the network archetype or the fractal archetype, whatever we're using to describe this, it seems to kind of do the opposite. Like it wants to maximize surface area per unit of volume. Like it almost has no volume, but maximal surface area.
Yes.
Is that related to the purpose of these structures? Because again, a sphere, like a planet or a star, it's trying to it gets one dose of energy, not one dose. It's trying to conserve itself over time. Whereas it seems like the purpose of this fractal structure is to optimize exchange. It wants to interact with the environment or shuttle energy, matter, information to every little nook and cranny sort of thing. Is that related? Because then it seems like almost the fractal structure it's a structure of economization ultimately, which is interesting to your point where you say, okay, 3 spatial dimensions plus 1. I automatically think of time. I'm like, oh, well, time is the 4th dimension. And then, so if the fractal structure is meant to economize, that means it's dealing with the 4th dimension of time in the most efficient way possible. That's a whole lot I just spilled out there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I don't. We can talk about time separately, but no, but I think that you've got it. You said it correctly. That another way of looking at what your, for example, circulatory system is doing, but these kinds of biological networks are doing, is maximizing the interface between its terminal units, that's where like our capillaries, and whatever it's supplying. Okay, so the cells in this instance, and it wants to maximize it in the most efficient way, and it accomplishes that through having a fractal structure. In order to take the other piece that comes into it, is that you have to take something that is macroscopic, like your heart and pumping the blood through, and take it down to something that is microscopic, which is your cells, and you have to do it in a way that maximizes the exchange in order to maximize the feeding of metabolic energy to the cells, and as well as receiving energy from the cells. So it is fundamental to this, from this viewpoint, is ideas of what I said earlier, optimization and efficiency. And indeed, I didn't say this, but one of the things that comes out of the theory, and that is in agreement with the data, which I already emphasized, is this 3/4 power scaling law of metabolic rate, which I didn't use the word sublinear. It was implied, that is, linear is, just to repeat what I said earlier, linear is double the size, you need twice as much metabolic energy. Not the case. That's linear. Sublinear is double the size, I need less than twice as much. And in fact, the theory shows that it should be roughly 25% less each time you double. And that's what the data shows. That's so-called Kleiber's law. And that shows an extraordinary economy of scale, systematic, predicted economy of scale, the bigger you are. And what it says is that the metabolic rate of an individual cell is decreasing systematically and predictably with the size of the animal. So even though I said earlier, your liver cell, your horse's liver cell, and a whale's liver cell, and your dog's liver cell are all basically the same. They're those fundamental units. However, because of the constraint of the network, your liver cell is working less hard than your dog's, but it's working harder than your horse's and harder than a whale.
Right.
So this is the basis of why it is that big things generally live longer than small things. That's why a mouse lives only 1 to 2 years, a shrew for about a year, and a whale lives for about 120. Blue whale can live maybe as long as 125 years, even though they're made of the same stuff with the same genes. The amount of work that is having to be done by a cell systematically decreases. So going back to what I talked about in entropy, it is producing less entropy the bigger you are. And so you live longer in a systematic way.